The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.
Where we discuss topics related to your overall emotional well-being and health. I'm Julianne Schroeder.
I'm Whitney Bunch.
I'm JC Rader. And
you can find us at White Rock Counseling here in Dallas. Yeah.
And San Antonio.
Yeah, and she's live in the flesh today.
Yeah. Yes.
For those that have been watching, we're excited to have Whitney in studio with us. But we're so excited that you're tuning in today because our mission here at Everyday Therapy Podcast is to inspire you with tips, stories, and information for your everyday therapy life.
Yes. And we are on iTunes, so please help us out and rate and review us. Give us what you think of it. Give us some feedback. And you can also donate on our website to help us out as well. But today we are talking about recovering the authentic self. This is so
magical,
right? Yeah. And like deep.
Yeah.
Like that sounds very
get
deep.
Their soul on.
Yeah. And so we have Taylor Zebrosky here, and she is an LPC, licensed professional counselor, licensed chemical dependency counseling intern. Mm-hmm. That's a mouthful. NCC EMDR-Trained. So she has a lot of credentials and trained in the recovering the authentic self as well. Tell us a little bit more about you. We all went to school together, so it's kind of cool to have you here.
Yeah,
years later. That's probably 5 years ago.
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm Taylor Zebrosky. I'm LPC, LCDC-I, NCC, EMDR-Trained, DBT-Trained, and PIT-Trained.
All the acronyms.
And I think, why did I do all that? Because I'm passionate about helping people heal from really the core issues that keep them stuck. And so after graduation, the real work starts on how do you really learn on what people are getting stuck on. And so doing additional trauma trainings and skill trainings was something that was really important to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I think like through like counseling training, like that only goes so far. Like we have to get additional training because we see with our clients that like they need a little bit more, which is cool. So what is the authentic self?
So today I'm talking about PM Melody's model. And so when I say I'm PIT trained, that's based off of PM Melody's model, and it stands for post-induction therapy. And her idea behind that was it's post the trauma. And so the therapy that happens post the induction of childhood trauma. And she defines, and I know this is kind of wild to think about, but she defines childhood abuse as anything less than nurturing.
I love that, because when you think of trauma, you think of something like really big that has to happen. Like, I don't know, like I imagine it, like to make a metaphor here, like a broken leg versus like a scratch, but a trauma can be like something small that impacts you aren't even aware of.
Yeah, I like how you've said before, like capital T trauma and lowercase t trauma.
Right.
Well, you know what? I'm going to get controversial. I don't think I like that definition. Whoa. Well, because I think even that, big T, little t, we compare like something bigger and smaller, but trauma essentially, I don't know, this is a definition that I've heard that I really like, and I'm curious. Yeah, sorry, I just jump in. But that trauma is anything that overwhelms us when we don't have the skills at that time to deal with.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're validating everybody's.
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah, that's my thoughts on.
And I agree with that in a sense that when Pia's talking about what is abuse, what is childhood abuse, and it being anything less than nurturing, when you think of things and life in general from these little kid eyes and really needing something that you're not getting, or needing nurturing that you're not receiving, that is overwhelming, and that's overwhelming to the system. And when we talk about trauma, and this is kind of going down a rabbit trail, but we
love
trauma.
rabbit trails.
We experience trauma in our whole selves. Like, we hold trauma in our body. And so it's not just cognitively what we know to be a trauma, like a tornado wipes your house out, or you were bullied a lot at school, but sometimes things happen that were less than nurturing events that are traumatic, and that's childhood trauma, and we also store that in our bodies.
Yeah. So is it safe to say that we probably all have, like, I mean, majority of people have that?
In my belief and understanding, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's on a continuum of how severe it is.
Sure, and Pia talks about good enough parenting. And so being a good enough parent and being able to love and nurture your kids in a way in which they're able to be resilient, where they're not having these relational conflicts that I'll talk more about as we get a little bit deeper into what her model is, that they're able to be in their functional adult more oftentimes than not. And so that's the goal, is to be good enough parents, or to be resilient in that fact. And so, but yes, we do all on a continuum experience those wounds.
Yeah. And so from my understanding, so we can have these childhood experiences with our parents or caregivers or even friends, right? Maybe, or peers, or
Authority figures of any sort.
authority. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. We can have these experiences, and they can color how we have relationships with people.
Right, and so she talks about it from a relational standpoint and relational trauma. And so first she talks about what is the nature of a child. What is the nature? She calls it the precious child. And so all children, right, all children are precious. And so when we think about what is the nature of the precious child, they're valuable, right? They're valuable just as they are. They're vulnerable, and they need protection. They're imperfect. They make mistakes. They're human. They are dependent. They're really needy little beings, little precious children, and then they're spontaneous, and they're open, and they're curious. And so she defines this precious child, and then goes on to say, when less than nurturing events occur, that's when we've experienced childhood trauma, and we adapt. We adapt to as a result of those traumas, and then as a result of that, in adulthood, we have relational issues. And she defines that relational immaturity as codependence.
Like, we pick up these survival skills, and then later on in life, they don't serve us anymore.
The patterns repeat.
Of how to get cared for or loved or get your needs met in some way.
Right,
form or fashion.
right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I know
So cool.
we know what codependence is, but for those that aren't really in the therapist lingo, could you give us like a good definition?
Yeah, so she breaks it down as 5 primary symptoms of codependence. Is we have trouble esteeming ourselves. Like, we have trouble feeling valuable as we are, good enough in who we are. We have trouble protecting and nurturing ourselves. And so that really speaks to our vulnerability issues. We have trouble being real and being authentic, because when our reality is denied, sometimes we feel like we must be good and perfect, or bad and rebellious. We have trouble attending to our needs and wants. So folks who struggle with self-care and being able to identify, like, this is what I need. This is when I need to say no or say yes to something. And then lastly, the last primary symptom of codependence is we have trouble living a life with an attitude of moderation in all things. And so oftentimes folks are just really, really rigid, or really, really struggling with spontaneity to a point where it's hindering their ability to have functional relationships.
Yeah. Well, and you put it like that, it sounds so relatable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could all.
It's like assertiveness and boundaries and being yourself and letting other people get to know you.
Yeah.
And knowing, like, having awareness of your needs and being able to ask for them.
Yeah.
So many different things.
Taylor, do you know the Enneagram?
No, I've heard you guys speak on it, but no, I'm not trained in that.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say.
We aren't either, but we enjoy it.
Yeah, JC and I are twos, the helpers and
Caregivers.
So, I mean, unhealthy twos definitely resemble codependence.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Well, and I know before we got started, you asked, how did I come into this? How did I fall into this line of work and really choose to get extra training in Pia's model? And that's why, because through my own recovery from codependence, things get bad enough and you're like, this isn't okay anymore. I'm not having functional relationships. Something has to change. And so I realized through working in addictions and trauma, I was like, I'm a codependent. This needs to change. And so through recovery in that area and learning how to validate myself from within and set boundaries and learn how to live a more healthy life relationally, I came across her work and it changed my life. It's changed the way I love and live. It's changed the way I am with my clients and the work that I do. And it's changed the way I parent my child.
Oh my gosh, I'm sure.
Now we're all going to go sign up for this training.
Yeah. If you could pick one thing that you have grown in that really has transformed your life as a result of this, can you narrow it down?
Wow. One thing.
Yeah, no, that's a lofty question.
Goodness. So I would say it probably really stems from validating reality. When I think of it from the lens of being a mom and looking at my little kiddo, no matter who he is as a human, really giving voice to that and allowing that to be his. And then being able to reflect on allowing myself to be human and myself to be perfectly imperfect, as Pia says, and lean into that. Because I think oftentimes we get stuck in, we have to be living to the standard that society says is good enough. And we forget that we're humans and that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to fail and we're going to fall flat on our face, and that's okay. And so I think that's one of the big things that I've taken from digging deeper into this work is the ability to just be.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of self-compassion.
Yeah.
And it's not always 100%, but it's something that I work on,
Well, it sounds like once you're able to see and be aware and accept what's going on for you, the reality piece, it really just domino effect changes the way you love and see relationships.
Yeah, and I will say just the way I view my clients, the way I view my friendships, the way I view my relationships has all changed once you're able to see things from the lens of the functional adult and the authentic, precious child, and being able to just step back and say, gosh, they're hurting. They have needs that weren't met, or this is what I need to do in this situation to take care of myself, versus kind of getting caught up in somebody else's junk, which formerly I would have done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the education piece really stood out to me. The more you learned, the more you became aware yourself. And now you're walking your clients through that. And it seems like boundaries and stuff like that and our needs, sometimes those are just big blind spots.
Yeah, and oftentimes when I say, you need to set a boundary, the first thing I hear is, how do you do that? What does that even look like? And I get that, and we practice that. And okay, what are you okay with? What are you okay with? What are you not okay with? And how do you want this relationship to look? And so going back to how to set boundaries to protect yourself. We talk in Pia's work about the listening and the containment boundary, how we protect ourselves, but also how we protect others from our stuff. And that's our containment boundary. And so really walking clients through how to practice that is a big part of their journey.
Yeah. And I can see, tell me if you see this a lot, but I could see it even for myself of, growing up in a certain way and having certain habits and it being very unconscious to not even know what healthy boundaries look like, or to know what I'm comfortable with or what I'm not comfortable with.
Right, and that speaks to core issue number one, being able to even have a sense of self. right?
Okay.
Like not even knowing who we are to be able to navigate what our boundaries are, what we're okay with. And so when we start delving into this work, it's truly just looking at the whole self, the whole precious child, and the nature of that we want to move into our functional adult, because the role of the functional adult is to take care of the wounded child and the adapted adult child. And so now we know what the precious child looks like. So then when those less than nurturing events happen, that childhood trauma happens, then we have our wounded child, our adapted adult child. So our wounded child is
An older version.
our wounded child is when childhood trauma happens from birth to 5.
Okay.
And so in that state, the kiddo, and I have a chart here. I don't think that it can be seen, but the kiddo really stays in this kind of less than place, esteeming wise. They have no boundaries. They're way too vulnerable. They feel bad. They're too dependent, and they're just out of control. As the kid grows, and we looked at the adapted adult child, that's when wounds happen from like 6-ish, 5, 6-ish to like 17-ish. And that adaptation can take on one of 3 or multiple adaptations. And so we have the hero role, we have the scapegoat, and we have the lost child. And in each one of those, we react from our trauma wound differently, whether we're in a less than or a better than position, whether we're just completely walled off or we're too vulnerable, whether we feel like we have to be good and perfect or bad and rebellious, which is our scapegoat. And sometimes we're needless and wantless, or anti-dependent, or too dependent. And sometimes
It can come out in so many different
Yeah.
ways.
so many
You
different
got to do a
ways.
lot of digging.
Well, and
to
sometimes
notice how it affects you.
right, and sometimes if you have I tell my clients, how do you know when you're in a trauma response? When the response of the whatever happened, your reaction to that they don't match up. And so
I like that a lot.
So, like, to give an example, if somebody cancels on you, then you start to freak out, being like, oh, I did something wrong. I made them mad. Now they're not going to want to be my friend. Right.
Right.
Would that be like kind of an everyday example?
yeah, so somebody cancels on you. From 1 to 10, what would you say is like an appropriate level of upsetness to be in that situation? Like, what
I'd
number
feel
would you
like
give it?
disappointed,
Sure.
like maybe like a 3 or
Okay.
so.
So if someone reacts at like a 10, that difference between 3 and 10, that's from the past, right? That idea of if it's hysterical, it's historical. And so so that's your trauma talking. And so oftentimes that's one of these. That's one of your adapted adult children.
Taylor, can we go into the hero, lost child, and scapegoat so that people listening could be like, oh, yeah, maybe sometimes I'm like that?
And I must say, most of us are more than one.
Yeah.
And we have a different relationship with different caregivers. So, like, I am
Oh, that's
a
interesting.
hero with one caregiver and a lost child with another caregiver. And then, like, at different parts of my life, I was one and and another. So,
You're not
That
locked
makes
in.
sense.
you're
yeah.
not locked in.
Yeah, because you're kind of taking whatever space is available with that parent or within the family.
Right. And each parent offers they bring something different to the table, right? And sometimes we only have one, and sometimes,
And they have their own stuff that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
which is how we get in this situation,
Yeah.
because parents aren't oftentimes aware of what they're bringing to the table, right?
Which, going into that, I have a lot of clients who it's difficult to acknowledge that their parents have any like flaws or negative. Like, it's so hard to see this hero that you've seen all of your life. And I try and tell my clients so often, and maybe you can speak to what you tell your clients. of like, we're not like blaming them or, you know, trying to make a list of everything wrong, but make sense out of what's going on for you right now. Like, okay, they treated you this way, and so I've developed these coping skills for that.
Right. I found that parents do the best they can with what
Yes.
they have
Yeah.
in the moment, and
But we have to talk about it.
Right, and sometimes it's not
make
quite
changes.
enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes we needed nurturing in a different way than they could provide in that moment, and it doesn't make them bad. It doesn't mean their parenting was bad. It was what it was in that moment, and sometimes, like, speaking to what you spoke to, it could be something seemingly insignificant in the moment, but really impactful to the individual. And so I too, like, I don't think most parents don't intentionally set out to harm their child. They're just doing the best with what they have. And sometimes they come from family systems that weren't nurturing in the ways they needed as well. And so that generational trauma takes effect.
So interesting.
Yeah. Do you have any stats on that? Just I hear, I guess I get that question a lot. Like, just, I mean, and there's different forms of abuse, but do you know off the top of your head as far as just like the correlation between, well, I guess abuse, recycling? Does that make sense?
No, I don't have any stats off the top of my head, but from what I've seen clinically, it's significant.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, I think that goes back to what you're saying, just like validating your own experience. Like, it can be true that you love your parents and you see them as very good, but also like going back and thinking about things that maybe like affected you or influenced your development or how you are in relationships, or it can be a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you can have both sides. Like, you can feel happy and also feel sad at the same time. So it's like similar to that in my mind.
Right. And I think that's part of the growth in your own therapeutic work is to be able to step back and say, hey, this is what I needed. And now when you're building your functional adult and you're growing, the goal is to be able to walk alongside that adapted adult child and say, okay, I can provide that.
I love that. I just saw well, do you call it a meme, or maybe it's just a quote? It was just a quote.
Is it a meme or a meme?
Right. Anyways, but alluding to the idea, give your inner child or your young child what it needed.
Yeah.
Right. So we don't have to stay victim to the circumstances.
Yeah.
Right.
I went through that phase of like blaming my mom.
Yeah.
Sorry, mom. Or, you know, like, why did you raise me this way? And like now as an older adult, I can be like, okay, that wasn't that bad. Thank you, mom, for everything else. But give that to myself ultimately.
Right. And, you know, sometimes I ask my clients, okay, in that moment, how old did you feel? Because we don't oftentimes step back and think like, gosh, I am acting or reacting in this moment from a wound. Whether it's my little kid or my adapted adult kiddo, I'm like 5 years old right now and I'm pitching a tantrum, which I've done. And sometimes what you need in those moments is just to cry and for your reality to be validated and to say, okay, I can comfort myself, or I can ask for a hug if that's what I need right now.
Yeah. Well, and I even think about growing up in family systems, you see certain like rules or guidelines or just modeling behavior around certain feelings. So if you grew up in a family where you were not supposed to cry or no one cried, then you might feel like something's wrong with you just because you might be more of a crier.
Yeah.
So just little subtle things.
Yeah. And kiddos are, they're little sponges. And no matter if it's said or if it's just an emotion in the room, they get that and they just soak it up. And so it's really important in the work that I do that people are aware of both their listening and their containment boundary, because when you're just spewing, that's being absorbed. And even if parents didn't say, hey, it's not okay to cry, you might have gotten the vibe that it's not okay to cry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kids are really intuitive. right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it would, if parents are self-aware, we're human, right? They're
Sure.
going to snap. But, while a vulnerable kid, the precious child, might then personalize, okay, oh, mom and dad are fighting. There's something like, oh, what am I doing wrong, right? But if the parents are aware, they can say, oh, hey, this is something that's going on with us, right? Because I think about like divorce and that being a common response. Like the kid is like concerned that they somehow caused the divorce.
Right.
Is that...
So in my opinion, it's really making it clear, hey, this is mine, not yours. And really working to still nurture the child in the areas, right? Their value, their vulnerability, their dependence, their spontaneity, and just really nurturing them and being really clear, like, okay, this is my battle. Like, these are my emotions. This is mom's or dad's or whomever. And it's your job to be a kid, right? It's not your job to soak up my stuff and then deal with it in the way in which is appropriate for your adaptation.
I'm just still thinking about the precious child because it's so adorable, but I like this work as also, it seems like the precious child is also within us.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of process of delayering and like removing some stuff.
Yeah.
Versus, I know that can be really helpful in people in any type of recovery or therapeutic process to not see themselves as broken or damaged or irreparable. Like, it's really, we have this precious child that has just gotten some stuff piled onto it.
Yeah.
Uncovering it almost.
Yeah. Recovering your authentic self.
Yeah, we get it.
So you are good at what you do, Taylor. Did you know that?
Tell us about, okay, so there's the wounded child that happens under age 5, and then 6 and up is kind of the time where we have the adapted adult child. And so, yeah, tell us about the hero, lost child,
And scapegoat.
Scapegoat.
So our hero is your falsely empowered child. So their self-esteem is like, I'm better than. And then their boundaries are, they're very walled. They're very walled and invulnerable. So I'm better than you. You're not getting in. Their reality is good and perfect. I've got to be good and perfect in everything I do. Don't make mistakes. They're very anti-dependent. I don't need anybody. And they're out of control with being in control of other people.
Oh, say that again, would you?
So
say it again.
they're out of control with being in control of people.
So they're asserting their control, but it's coming from a place of feeling out of control.
Yeah, see, look, JC's eyes light up. Mine too.
That's not an unhealthy 2 or anything.
So our second adapted adult child would be our lost child. And the lost child is the disempowered child. They feel less than others. They feel, they alternate between no boundaries at all or having walls up. Their reality is they must be good and perfect. They're needless and wantless. And they are also out of control with being manipulative of others. So this is our lost child.
Okay. So explain the difference. How is that different from like controlling others from the hero?
Yeah.
So they're manipulative of others.
So coming from a manipulative standpoint is there's this manipulation of like, okay, this is what I'm doing in this, with this control piece.
Okay, so it's almost like covered up in a way, like they're being manipulative versus like the hero, it might be like directly controlling somebody.
Right, and so
I don't know how important that is in our little.
We're curious.
Yeah.
right, and so both of those are very well. The lost child is rigid.
Okay.
You're going to see a lot of rigidity, and same with the hero, but really the lost child, you're going to see rigidity. And where you see that out of control is with your scapegoat. So your scapegoat is the falsely empowered, disempowered child. And so they feel less than. They're walled in and invulnerable. Their reality is bad and rebellious, so they're really good at being really bad. They're too dependent and they're out of control. So oftentimes, sometimes going back to that, how am I acting or reacting from a trauma response? Some people go right into rebellious child, right? And they are kind of road raging and all of this stuff. And so sometimes that's a trauma response, and they're acting from this place of being bad and rebellious and kind of walled off. Like, I'm not going to tell you how I really feel. I'm just going to show you.
Okay.
Ooh, passive aggressive.
I just had a thought, and we can move on if this isn't something you can answer. But as you describe these three, I don't know, is there any relation to birth order?
Well, I don't have that information on me. I've got some thoughts, but my initial response would be no, because it's really how we're attaching to our caregivers. Clinically, what I see says something different, just kind of in reality. But like, before I did any of Pia's work, I would have hands down said, I'm a hero. I'm a firstborn. I definitely have that role. But really looking at the attachments with caregivers, I really was more of a lost child. And so going back to that, it's really about what your attachment is to that caregiver or guardian or kind of big person in your life. And sometimes it changes. So, you know what? Maybe I was a hero from like 7, 8-year-old, and then about 12, 13, I really became a good scapegoat. And that's kind of what sometimes I go back to. And so people can vacillate.
Okay. That makes
Thanks
sense.
for putting up with my random questions.
And go. Well, so these roles that we pick up, and I know we're talking about like attachment to the caregiver, but then this goes into like all of our present day relationships.
Yes. And so the way this comes out in our present day relationships would be, so to get my notes. So we just have relational esteem issues. I'm wondering, has anybody, and you don't have to answer from yourself, but do you know what it's like to be in a relationship and be like, man, like I'm feeling less than or better than in this relationship, or I'm feeling kind of enmeshed, or avoidance issues in relationships, or
All of them.
Yeah, I do.
All the issues.
Yes.
And another thing, and another thing that we talk about is problems with interdependence. And so like a two-way street. Oftentimes what I see is people are really giving a lot into a relationship and not getting much out of it, or they are sucking, like they're
Taking too much.
They're taking too much. They're just sucking so much from the relationship that people then leave because it's not a two-way street. And so sometimes we have problems with interdependence, and we have intensity issues. So people who struggle with that core issue number 5 of moderation and spontaneity, there's a lot of intensity issues. So if you meet someone who has intensity issues, you know it right off the bat. You're like, whoa, came on a little strong there. And
So it's want to spend a lot of time with you and just really engaged and
right, and there's an intenseness to it. And so we see intensity issues pop up in all different kinds of ways in interrelational relationships, but that is a part of how we see this play out.
I see that so much with like clients, friends, myself, like being in relationships, like romantic relationships where it's like it's not equal.
Right.
And it's interesting to me because I had this realization at one point because I was the one kind of desiring other people more than they would give to me.
Right.
And then I had this realization of like, well, I want it to be two ways and like more equal. So I'd like drop off or let go. But that's such a hard realization to have that awareness that it's unbalanced
Right.
and to let go of that.
Yeah.
I struggle with explaining it to my clients.
Well, it's like when we have like an intimacy issue or it's like a mismatch, then I feel like we jump into the assumptions that are kind of what we've experienced as like these child roles. And then we think it's like about us or something wrong. And, you know, it's just this, like, again,
It's
like
all
a
making
blind spot.
sense.
We didn't know that we needed someone who desired us as much as we desired them. Like, it's like, oh, I didn't think about that.
Well, and to speak to that interdependence piece, it really goes back to being able to define what your needs and wants are. And can you take that into a relationship and say, you know what, this is really what I'm needing right now from you or from this relationship, and or this is what I want. Is that something you're able to give? And then being able to step back and say, okay, well, if the person's like, no, I don't have that, being able to then move forward and say, okay, can I make a decision for what I want and what I need, versus kind of staying in this weird place of not knowing what's going on.
Right. It sounds so simple whenever you break it down that way. I'm like,
It feels like if we're not able to say that, we spend all this energy trying to like merge with that person or like shape shift for that person.
Or manipulate.
Try to fix
control.
Yeah.
And there we have it.
That's bad.
Okay, tell us more about the
Intimacy.
immaturity issues.
Sure. So that's kind of a basic overview. But one thing I want to talk about too is how do we heal?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Because
That's important.
We're just talking about how we have all these issues and we're here.
So and that's what most people come into my office. They realize something's not right, and they want to feel different.
Yes.
And oftentimes they want the answer, and I can tell them this, and it's a journey of really figuring out how do you navigate what I need and what I want and who am I and how do I get to that place of being able to identify who my functional adult is, and my functional adult being healthy enough to like come alongside my wounded child and say, hey, it's okay. And love on my adapted adult child and be that nurturing that maybe wasn't there, right? And so when the wounded child feels less than and worthless, and I should pause and go back one step, the adapted adult child takes care of the wounded child.
Okay.
And so as I move through this kind of healing and repairing place, that'll make more sense if you know that. So the wounded child, when they feel less than and worthless, the adapted adult child will parent that wounded child by criticizing and attacking. Oh, you shouldn't feel that way. Like, pick yourself up. But the functional adult, who we want on board, heals and reparents by affirming, right? By affirming through self-esteem and reality. When the wounded child's feeling abandoned and feeling needy and wanting, the adapted child parents that wounded child by just neglecting them and abandoning them. But the functional adult nurtures. They take care of those dependency needs and wants appropriately, and they're able to set boundaries.
Can you, like, this is so big, but I feel like it's so powerful and makes so much sense. Could you explain that in like a real life scenario of like an abandoned, adapted adult, and how, like, what that would look like? Maybe we can all.
Yeah, maybe you think like about a client issue and. We've just put you on the spot.
You definitely did just put me on the spot.
Taylor, you are earning any post-podcast beers.
Like a romantic relationship?
So, well, let me ask this. Yeah. Are there any times where you've just had that, sinking feeling of like, I'm alone in this type feeling come up for you?
Oh, yeah. Like through a breakup, just like feeling really lonely.
Okay. Do you mind if I like continue talking
Let's
to you
do
about
it.
that? Okay. So in that moment, what all do you experience?
Okay, fear. So feeling like scared, like overwhelmed, sad, alone, crazy sometimes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So now in that moment, does that reaction warrant the situation? Like, was that a little bit more intense than really what the situation
for
warranted?
sure.
Okay. And so if you just kind of
breakups are hard, but yeah, it did feel like a little bit bigger.
a little more intense.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you were to go back, like just kind of allow yourself to think, like when was another time you felt
I start crying. No.
do you have tissues? So I might say, okay, gosh, like I remember being, little. I have no idea how old, but like I was standing at the soccer fields waiting for mom to pick me up, and nobody came. Like they forgot to pick me up. And those are those same feelings that are coming up for me right now that got triggered. That feeling of just being scared and feeling alone and like, where is everybody?
For sure.
So kind of correlating that. And then you might think like, just forget about it. Like, I'm not even going to worry about that. So that would be your adapted child. Like, don't even...
Like
Don't
for
even
me,
think
it
about
would have
it.
been like going through this breakup, and I can so relate to having those experiences like as a child. But saying to myself during this breakup of like, you should be over this.
Yeah.
Like you're
Minimizing.
fine. It's not that big of a deal. Why can't you just be happy?
Yeah, so you're
Move
completely neglecting that little one, right? That little one that's standing there at the soccer field, so scared and alone, and wondering, is anybody gonna to come get me? Does anybody love me? Like all of these feelings of abandonment, neglect, and then it's like, okay, no, get over it. And so really what we're hoping is that as you walk on your journey, your therapeutic journey of healing, that the functional adult comes on board and says, you know what, come here, let me nurture you. These are the boundaries that I need to set. This is what I need right now. This is what I want right now within an appropriate range. And so, obviously, if someone's like wanting to act out in a certain way that's not healthy, we're not advocating for that. We're advocating for things within appropriate means. But the functional adult would come on board and say, okay, your heart is hurting right now. Maybe you need to call a friend. Maybe you need to reach out and connect with someone. Maybe you need to relax for a couple hours or a day. Maybe, looking back on this relationship, are there different ways that I can set boundaries to protect myself
In the future.
and still be vulnerable enough to build a relationship? And so
So it doesn't feel like your world is crashing when it ends.
Right. So we're able to then have a response that correlates with what's appropriate for that event. Because you're right, breakups are hard. Like that does hurt. It's not going to be like, oh, this shouldn't hurt at all, because then we're in a different situation.
Yes.
of,
Right, there's some
of
denial
response,
going on there.
right?
Yeah. I'm fine.
But being able to recognize, whoa, this was a little bit more intense. Okay, like I'm feeling abandoned in a way that's like much deeper. And so bringing that, knowing when you're in the wounded child or the adapted adult child, and being able to then say, okay, bringing my functional adult on board. And the goal is to be in your functional adult more oftentimes than not, right?
Yeah.
To be able to
Tap into that.
Yeah.
And seems like that can come naturally sometimes.
to be in your functional adult.
Yeah.
Well, I think about like the healing process of that is so, because if you're in that state, you could go so many different ways, like shutting down, minimizing your feelings, criticizing yourself,
Right.
never dating again, so you could have like so many.
And that speaks to the adapted adult child, right? I'm walled off, nobody's ever getting in again, or I'm completely out of control and I'm going to date everybody possible. Like these are those adapted trauma states. And so really neglecting what you really need, which is the ability to set boundaries and to be able to identify what you need and want and to act from a place of health. And then lastly, when the wounded child feels out of control, the adapted child parents by indulging. So just go for it. This is where we see a lot of addiction.
Okay.
And then the functional adult functions or heals and reparents by setting limits. So through boundaries and practicing moderation.
Being able to say no.
Yeah, it's so much of like knowing your needs, knowing your boundaries, knowing yourself. Validating your feelings.
Yeah, validating your reality
Yeah.
of, hey, you know what? I'm not crazy. This does hurt.
Yeah.
I think it could just be so helpful, like all those situations, like breakups or even more, when you're just feeling like confused. Like, why is this happening to me? What is this about? And then we could make so many faulty conclusions.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah, good stuff for sure.
I'm noticing our time. Is there anything else that we need to know?
I think this is a really good overview.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely
so
could have.
We all have some
put it
thinking
into
to do.
Yeah, no, I'm
Take
like
these
reflecting on all
papers.
my dating relationships. I've got some work.
Add it to your Bumble profile. Wounded child.
And like I said, this was how my journey with Pia's work really started, of being able to recognize, whoa, I can relate, just like everyone, because we're all humans who have been raised by humans, who did the best they could, but I've never met anybody who was 100% nurtured in the way that they needed. And so usually there are some wounds there.
That's normalizing.
Well, and
too.
it's like this perfection thing. Like, so many of them, it was the need to be perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And do you encourage your clients to be patient with themselves in the healing process?
Always.
Asking for a friend? No, actually, okay, besides myself, also thinking about, I have a lot of clients that come in and they say verbatim, why am I not over this? And they have a hard time validating the reality that relational trauma is something that's difficult to work through. Doesn't mean that's like impossible, but can take some time, right?
Right. And you didn't get here overnight,
Yeah.
right? I
It
mean,
only
you
took
didn't.
29 years.
You didn't get here overnight, and so you're not going to be able to turn it around overnight. I typically see clients for a long time because this stuff is heavy, and this stuff is deep, and it's often we have to chunk it up to be able to kind of chew on it for a while. My colleague Lynn and I, we do intensives, and that can really help with the clearing out process of relational trauma, but oftentimes it's a process. It's a longer process.
Yeah. It's like an entire life review.
Yeah. Well, and I would assume like this is how I see my clients. You know, they might see me for, you know, quite a while, and we work through some stuff, and maybe they kind of feel like they're at a good set point. But then stuff will continue to come up like throughout your entire life, most likely.
Yeah, because oftentimes, you know, we get to a point where we're feeling healthier, relationships are going well, and, you know, you're performing in the ways in which you want, and then something happens and you're like, whoa, where did that come from? Why was my response like that? And something was uncovered that you didn't remember was there. And so then that's when I tell my clients, it's just time for a check-in.
Yeah.
You know, like, come
Well,
back
and
in, let's talk about it.
even if, you know, we encourage therapy, obviously, from this podcast, but even if you're not in therapy, just like a reevaluation and really looking at your relationships and how you're interacting.
Yeah.
Right.
Be willing to look at yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, with compassion, not judgment.
Compassion and in reality, like you're saying.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. What is your like favorite thing about doing this work with people?
So later on in the process, there's so much that, I mean, I could talk.
I knew it was
about
gonna be hard
We
to
could have a whole
Yeah, but-
podcast on that.
There's a part in the intensive that we do where clients give back stuff that wasn't theirs. So when we talked about kiddos kind of absorbing what's not contained in their environment, oftentimes clients will walk through lives or their whole life holding on to shame that's not theirs, that was from a perpetrator, or anger that was from dad not being able to contain himself, or all of this kind of stuff that was just kind of oozed out and they absorbed, and them being able to get to a place of being like, this isn't mine, I'm not holding it anymore.
Wow.
Sounds so freeing.
And empowering. Yeah.
Tears.
Oh, great question.
awesome.
Well, should we end with one last question? Do we have something from our Let's Chat?
Yeah. Let's see here. So let's go to our Let's Chat section. So we already answered one of the questions. What was codependence? When do you cross the line of being loyal to being codependent?
When you're having relational issues. So when you step back and you look at these, okay, where do I stop and somebody else starts, right? And am I able to esteem myself? Am I able to set boundaries? Am I able to really camp out in that functional adult? Or am I enmeshing with someone or denying who I am to the fault of being loyal?
Yeah. So would it be safe to say, like, when there's extreme denial of needs?
Right. So my question would be, can you be loyal to someone and be able to say, hey, you know what, I disagree. Like,
Oh,
I
wow.
still
Yeah.
love you and support you, but I disagree with you in this area, or this is what I need. Like, is this relationship a one-way street or is it a two-way street?
Yeah.
So I know that's not a cut and dry answer, but
Yeah.
that would be my approach.
That
to it.
sounds, yeah, I think that's super helpful, though.
I got the picture of like a Venn diagram. Like there's a little overlap in relationships, but not like crossing
Right.
over.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Or merging.
Yeah.
Kind of knowing that there's two whole people.
And that's exactly the goal, right? To have two whole people who know who they are, know what their boundaries are, who are able to give and take from the relationship without just being globs of enmeshment or one person needing something and the other person turning their back. And this turns, this is in all relationships, friendships, parenting, children relationships. Like, we don't want to enmesh our children. Like, they're their own little beings in our marriages and dating relationships. And so it really comes into play in everything.
Yeah. Sounds like it just infiltrates out. Yeah. What are some resources if somebody's interested in this? Like, can they read something or?
Pia Melody is Facing Codependence.
Okay.
Is the book that this is derived from, and the book that changed my life and has changed so many others' lives. And so pick this up at Barnes & Noble or wherever you buy books. It's fantastic, and she has a couple other books that are also good reads.
Okay. And tell us about your intensive and where we can find you at.
So I'm an owner at Highland Village Counseling in Highland Village, Texas. My colleague Lynn and I run family of origin intensives based off of this work.
Okay.
We alternate them, men 1 month, women 1 month. They're gender separate groups. We keep it very small, between 2 and 4 participants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's intense work. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we do that over 3 days, 3 full days of work. So it's typically like 9 to 5-ish. And we do those monthly.
Okay. Very cool. Anything else?
Anything you would like to? Last thing you would want to tell our listeners?
Oh, I did write that down. Hold on. In my
What
notes.
are your last words on this podcast?
Right, just to know that we're perfectly imperfect and that we all have inherent value. And so that's really the nature of the functional adult, is to be able to lean into that. And I think that's something that can often be so difficult to really swallow, because that's not the messages we oftentimes get, is that we can be imperfect and we have value. And so just leaving people that with the message of we're inherently valuable and we're perfectly imperfect.
I love that. That's a good note to end on.
Yes.
And also,
And also, like our podcast.
yeah, like our podcast, rate and review us on iTunes, and donate if you feel called to do so. Share with your friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was so
Thank you
great.
for having me. Thank you so much.
Yeah.